A few words about my life since Tule Lake and my family's life since Tule Lake. And the reason this picture is here is because this was taken at the pilgrimage a few months ago, and these are the Tule Lake babies. And I'm one of the Tule Lake babies. So all of these people, including myself, were born at Tule Lake during 1942-45 period. And this is chronological. That fellow on the left is the oldest, and I'm the second oldest of the group. So, and this was taken sort of spontaneously. If we got all the people who were born at Tule Lake at the pilgrimage, we probably would have had maybe 25 or 30 people. But this was taken late at night after the final performance, and we just got some people together as quickly as we could. There were at the pilgrimage about almost 400 people. About 80 of them were 85 years old and 85 and older. Karen, you say that there were 35 and younger, a good group. So we're seeing a very good dichotomy of ages in the pilgrimage now. And what we're trying to do is encourage the older people to attend, because they're not going to live that much longer. They have memories that we want them to share with us. And I'll bring that up to let you know the power of the pilgrimage. I'll tell you a little bit about my family, my mother and father first. And I was thinking that what I have to say is based on my observations of them. I never talked to them about this, and so they both passed away, and I don't know if they would agree with me or not, or if they've ever thought of it or not. This is just the way I see them today, going back all these years. My parents are both Nisei. They were born in Alameda, California. My father was born 1910, my mother 1918. They're both also Kibe. Nisei means second generation, which means also that they were born in America and they were automatically American citizens. Kibe means that they were born in America but went back to Japan soon after they were born. And in both cases, my mother and father, I think they were like 1 or 2 years old, and they went back to Japan. In most cases, it was for educational purposes. In my parents' case, I think it was more because of economic reasons. It was easier for the grandparents in Japan to take care of them in their separate families than it was for their parents to take care of them in Alameda. They were my grandparents were struggling to make it. I don't think there was a lot of money in the family, and therefore my parents went back to Japan, came back to America when they were probably 18 or so, 18, maybe 20 years old. I was born in 1942. My parents were at Tule Lake at the time. They went to Minidoka, which was another one of the camps that Tricia pointed out in Idaho. From there, they started out in the Bay Area of California. They were in the Seattle area when the war came and the internment process began, and therefore they ended up at Tule Lake and stayed there for a while until they went to Minidoka. After Minidoka, the war ended perhaps early 1945. They went back to the Bay Area. In many cases, in several cases, the Japanese who were in the camps, wherever the camp might have been, maybe most particularly in Tule Lake, the communities where they came from in California or Oregon or Washington did not welcome them. In many cases, there were threats to the Japanese. The word got back to the camps that you would not be safe if you went back to your home in Sacramento Valley, or San Francisco, or Hood River, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington. Many of the families went back to their homes. Many of them ended up going to Chicago or Minneapolis or places outside of the West Coast because they felt it was safer. There was at least some welcome by the communities. There were jobs maybe available. Many ended up in New York. I'm not sure what the migration was to the New England area. Probably not too many. But my parents, for whatever reason, and I think there was some sort of placement service that was offered at Minidoka, found a job with a wealthy family in Marin County. And so my father, who was not well educated, my mother, who was not well educated, and before the war they did not have money nor really good jobs. They got positions as a gardener. My father was the gardener, the chauffeur, the handyman around the house. My mother was the cook and the maid and the house cleaner for a wealthy family, a doctor in Ross, California. They stayed there for about a year, and for whatever reason they left, and my father started his life with me and my mother, and it was a pretty rugged life. I recall the first place we lived was a old army barracks in Alameda, right next to the train station, and we stayed there for a few years. My father made a living as a gardener, and I think if you looked at the way the Japanese in the West Coast made their living during that period, you'd find more than 50% were either farmers, worked in agriculture, or were connected to the land somehow. My father was trained as a gardener or as a farmer, and so he tried to make it as a gardener. Others were retailers. They had maybe small stores, laundries, things of that sort. But my father, he had a little pickup truck, a lawnmower, a couple of rakes, and he got some customers and made a living that way. We moved from there to Oakland, California, and that's where I grew up. Went to public school in Oakland, and moved on from there. Karen asked me to speak a little bit about the effects of Tule Lake and the war experience on my family. And the way I see it is that my father and mother worked very hard. They always saved their money. They ended up having a nice house in a nice neighborhood in Oakland, but it was not an easy road. They had to work to save, to not go out to dinners and do fancy vacations. Their life was to have a steady, stable life, save your pennies, and do the best you can. And that's the way I grew up. My father was a gardener. Every Saturday, junior high school, even when I was going to college, I would help my father. In the summer times, I'd help my father in his gardening. After that, of course, I moved on with my life. But in the early years, it was hard work. Everybody contributed. Another aspect of my mother's and father's life, as I see it, is that while they lived in American society, they were not really a part of the mainstream. They lived before the war in a Japanese community. They were Kibe. They spoke Japanese. Their lifestyle was Japanese. They ate Japanese food. After the war, or during the war, the community, of course, in the camp at Tule Lake in Minidoka was purely Japanese. And after the war, the comfort zone was to be with fellow Japanese. And they went to the Buddhist church in Oakland, and that was a center for my mother's life more than my father. They were members of local groups that were Japanese-based. They met on weekend nights and played hana, a Japanese card game. And my father would play poker. But, you know, the entertainment was in the house. It was not going to a restaurant. It was not taking a cruise. And because of the way they lived, I think they did not feel totally comfortable in white America. My father never felt like he could mingle, or he did not mingle that much with the white part of society. His friends were Japanese. The neighbor next door might have been a white family, and because of the closeness, you know, he might have been friends with them, but socially he was, for the most part, Japanese. And it was because of a feeling of more equality. Maybe there was a little bit of inferiority feeling in the white culture. And I would say that within the way they lived, there were effects, very strong effects from what happened during the war. I think that it had a profound impact on the way they thought about how they live, how they should live, what their place in life was, and therefore, you know, the ambitions were never real high. They lived a good, comfortable life, but the ambition was never to go beyond being a gardener, in my father's case. My situation, I would say, was different. I was born during the war, but you know, I would say that I was not affected by it. I was just a newborn, really, after the war was over. I went to public school beginning in Alameda through Oakland, which was easy. I think things got back to normal after the war pretty quickly. The resentment to the Japanese that existed in maybe 1945 and 46, it seemed, in my young mind anyway, it seemed to not be there. It was, I didn't feel any discrimination. My parents may have, but I didn't feel it. You know, my friends were whoever was in the neighborhood, or whoever were in my classes. Oakland High School, the same way. I went to the University of California at Berkeley, and a reflection of the way my father and mother thought was that after I graduated, I had to choose what I was going to do. I decided that I would go on for graduate work, and I could have done several things. My father wanted me to become a veterinarian, and I think that was a safe thing for Japanese, to become something, a professional person in the medical field, a dentist, a veterinarian. A second choice might have been a lawyer. There were some Japanese lawyers floating around. I decided I wanted to go to business school and to get my MBA. Now, my father was very much against that, because he thought that there would be no place for a Japanese in the white business world in America. I persisted, and so I ended up getting my MBA. I went to Berkeley, got my MBA. After that, I left my father's and mother's house, which again was something that was not something I was supposed to do. My parents wanted me to stay with them, and that's part of the Japanese mentality. However, I wanted to get out. I moved from Oakland to New York City, and soon after met and married Dana, And from that period on, I stayed on the East Coast. I lived mostly in New York, worked in New York City, and then moved to Connecticut, where we lived for 15 years, and now we're in Newport, Rhode Island. But during that whole period, I got away from the Japanese community. After moving to the East Coast, when I was living in California, I went to Japanese school at the Buddhist church every Saturday morning. At Berkeley, I took 4 or 5 years of Japanese language. I spoke Japanese at home, ate Japanese food. However, once I left, my life changed. I married Hakujin, an Italian woman. I lost my Japanese language. We ate spaghetti rather than gohan. And I worked in a culture that was American. And so for that period after leaving, I became less Japanese over the years. I believe in 2006, I was visiting my parents in the Bay Area. They were still living in Oakland. And I met somebody by chance who said, "Hey Ken, there's a pilgrimage coming up, Tule Lake pilgrimage." And through those years, I had never even thought of Tule Lake or a pilgrimage, but something in me told me that, there's an obligation, a moral obligation for me to consider a pilgrimage to Tule Lake where I was born. And so I signed up quickly, and I would say, and went to the pilgrimage, and I will say that, as many people have said, it was a life-changing experience for me, because after being away from the Japanese for so long, Japanese people, and just being in a group of people who look Asian, and to be in this group of very talented, articulate, smart, successful people with experiences to discuss, it just opened my mind to something that I didn't think could happen. And I've been to every pilgrimage since. In the slides that you showed, Leanne, there was one you showed of the group discussion, and that is a group meeting, very informal. Maybe about 60 people are sitting in a large room, and the moderator asks people who have experienced Tule Lake to speak about their experiences. And in some cases, there are men and women who are, let's say, 80 years old or 85 years old, who have, since 1942 or 1943, have not discussed this at all with anybody. And then all of a sudden, they just open up and start talking, and the tears come down their faces. And in some cases, the grandson is sitting in the audience. The grandson hears his grandpa speaking about his experiences for the very first time, and it's a shattering, wonderful, beautiful experience. And this is what Tule Lake is. It's bringing the people who have been there, experienced it, together with the younger generation, including myself, who, because I was not aware of many of these things that took place, or the emotions that existed, to see that and to feel that and to talk to the people and to learn about what happened during that period of World War II and after, and all the influences that that period had on people's lives. It was just a good, wonderful, eye-opening experience for me. And the thing that happened to me was that after all these years of being away from the Japanese culture and mentality, I became Japanese again. I came back to understanding where I came from, where I was born, being Japanese, the importance, the beauty of being Japanese. And so for me, it's been a wonderful thing. And this past pilgrimage, they asked me to join the board of the Tule Lake Committee, so I'm going to become much more involved with the group now, and I will continue to go to the pilgrimages. What happened was I went to the first one not that long ago by myself. The second one, I believe I went by myself, but both of them were such wonderful experiences. The next time, which was maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I asked my wife to go with me. So Dana attended with me, and it was a wonderful experience, eye-opening experience for her. 2 pilgrimages ago, I asked my 3 daughters to go with me, in addition to my wife. And my youngest daughter, who's here, just had a child, so I had my 3 daughters, my wife, and a newborn child that we carried around with us for 4 days. This past pilgrimage, I had 2 daughters and my wife with me. And so it's become a family event, and it's a wonderful thing. Let me say one thing. It's become such a popular event, and there's a limited enrollment to it, registration, because of limited space. The infrastructure is small. They can only hold like 350 people. And so once the registration announcement is made, this past pilgrimage, it got filled up in 2 weeks. And so you had to rush. I had to learn exactly when the announcement was going to be made. I rushed to get my registration in there. There's no special privileges for anyone. You have to get your name in there. And so after 2 weeks, you were out of luck if you weren't in. And so there were maybe 100 people on the waiting list. Maybe, I don't know how many of those got in, but it was not many. So I will say that it's been a full circle for me from the time I was born at Tule Lake to what's been happening to my life now.
Thanks, Ken.
When you moved to New York and you kind of grew away from a Japanese lifestyle because you were no longer living with your parents or in a group of Japanese, do you feel that was more kind of active by choice? Because certainly you could have associated with Japanese people in New York, or was it more of an inertia kind of thing? I mean, do you have a consciousness about why you chose to be, less involved in the Japanese community?
That's a good question. I would say that it was an active process. You're right. I could have gone. Living in New York City, there was a Buddhist church right up on 120th Street or whatever. I could have gone there. I could have associated with Japanese groups. I chose not to. I had my new life. I was trying to get into that. It did not include Japanese. It included whoever, and to me, it was a secondary issue to try to stay within the Japanese community.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's taken, and it's a process that can't be forced. It just happens to you through the years. You either, you pick your path and you take it, and it's taken me this many years to come back, but I'm thankful that path is taken.
Are there any other questions for Ken? Or comments? Stay up here for a second.
Did you have, or maybe they can answer, do your daughters, did they learn Japanese? Like, do you now, can you speak it again, or?
Well, the answer is yes and no. We were living in northern Westchester in New York at the time my children were growing up. And in White Plains, there was a Japanese school. Even as part of a university in Japan, they set up a school in America so they could keep the Japanese families in tune with the language. And so I sent my oldest daughter and then my second daughter. By the time we reached Mitzi, I couldn't do it anymore. And the reason is, I grew up speaking Japanese at home and taking all these years in college, Japanese. At this school that my children were going to, I could do the kanji in the first grade, and by the second grade, it was beyond me already. And so it was so hard that, and for one Saturday of classroom, and it was like from 9:30 to 12 or something like that, we had homework all week long, you know. It was tough. I've pretty much lost all the Japanese I have. My wife and I are going to go to Japan in October, so I got to quickly pick it up. Yeah.
Let's give Ken a round of applause for